I must say that I am of a Guyanese origin, so of course this means a lot to me. I am not physically in Guyana at this time, but of course I have followed all that is going on politically and in terms of its social development. And I must say that although I live and work here in Grenada, I did, I believe it was in 2006, leave Grenada and go to Guyana to stand as a national candidate for the Alliance for Change, as it then was. And the reason I did that was because I had done so much work in civil society before coming to live and work in Grenada. And I felt that because I had done so much work in civil society and had held myself out to be somewhat of a role model to women, because that was the focus of my work and advocacy, that I owed it to the women then to go back and be a candidate so that they can look up and see that women would advocate for change in society. Now, before I go on to tell you why I would encourage women to vote, especially young women who do not want to vote, I would say that even during that time, I've been doing a lot of work with women in the Caribbean, women who are in politics through the Caribbean Institute of Women in Leadership. And I was a founding board member, and I'm a founding member of that regional institution, which is supported mainly by UN Women, by the Commonwealth Secretariat and the OAS. I was supported by these women to at least go back to Guyana and encourage other women by my presence in terms of standing as a national candidate in those elections. Now, for women generally who may not think it important for them to vote in the upcoming elections in Guyana, I would say this. One, because women, as I said before, represent approximately 50% of the population of that country, if they do not have a say through using their right to vote about what they want for their future and the future of their children, well, then they will face difficulties. For example, if when the parliament is convened, however it is convened, there are not enough women there who would represent them as women, who would fight for their causes in parliament as women, who would monitor what is happening with government spending for women and women's health issues, women's empowerment issues, women in poverty, what is happening to the girl child, whether the girl child in Guyana is advancing or not advancing. In other words, if they stay away from the pool, whatever happens, they have themselves to blame. If when 2 years down the line, 3 years down the line, even 6 months, 100 days later, then the agenda, the legislative agenda, the way that governance is going forward is not in the interest of women generally. So obviously, if they opt out, well, then they opt out of how they want to be governed, how they want not only Guyana to develop, but what they would want a government coming into office after May 11 to do for themselves as women and for their families, for their communities, for their families, for their communities, for their society, and for the nation at large.
In the chat room, Christine asked, what significant contributions women have made that have impacted you?
What significant contributions I would have made?
No, women,
That
women have made that
okay.
that have impacted you.
I would say contributions that women have made that are significant
Yeah.
and have impacted me.
Yeah.
Let me see, for example, I said it before, seeing women go to the top of my own profession, such as Justice Desiree Bernard has done, not only in Guyana, but for the entire CARICOM region at the Caribbean Court of Justice. To see now in the Eastern Caribbean, where I live and work, that a woman is at the head of the judiciary, to see that on the Court of Appeal, which is headed by that woman who is a judiciary, there are two Guyanese-born women who sit as justices of appeal. For me, directly seeing those women there would mean to me that I can do it too. That is what I take away. I look, for example, at, let's say, the UN Women. I had a very, very good fortune and lifetime opportunity to represent the women of the Caribbean, to take gender messaging to the UN Global Conference on Sustainable Development, and to sit with the head of the UN Women's Organization, with that very esteemed lady from South Africa, from a region totally different from mine, but we could sit and understand because of her achievements, her international global achievements. I could sit and she would sit so easily and humbly with me, she being the head, the global head, and me just being a representative, a gender representative from the Caribbean, and be able to impart to me through her achievements the importance for me to grasp, for example, what is sustainable development, and what it means for women in the Caribbean, in Guyana, in Grenada, in the Eastern Caribbean, in the wider Caribbean, and why we have to stay engaged. So, for example, that was not originally my area of competence, sustainable development, which started off really and truly by climate change or with the climate change agenda and dialogue. But because I understood through her zeal, her achievements, the urgency with which she shared with me as to why I should continue with the advocacy not only for women's rights and empowerment, which means once we pursue that, that women will be equally the beneficiaries of sustainable development and be involved in the future of their respective countries and regions. But I understood because of her zeal, her experience, her example, her achievements, that I too could not become complacent, for example, because I was chosen to be a representative at a global conference. I had to come back and do more, to continue to do something because of what I experienced through her sharing her life experiences with me. I had to come back to my little space.
Tell us, tell us a little bit about that global conference that you attended.
Yes, now that was a conference in Samoa, and it was a conference that is telling us collectively that yes, we have achieved as women, as men, as the world, some of the Millennium Development Goals that we had set for ourselves as nations of the United Nations. And you know, all of our governments, through their leaders, went off and they signed off these Millennium Development Goals, which actually should have borne the fruit by 2015, which is this year. You know, equality for women, for example, and men. You know, women should have been empowered. We would have expected to see more women in our parliaments and in positions of leadership. We would have expected that would have had clean water for all by now, that children would have had, you know, unfettered access to education. That there were so many other ideals were agreed to by our governments that by 2050 we would have achieved these goals. A lot of them, of course, were very idealistic, but at least they were goals to work towards. But as we got closer to 2015, which we're in, last year, the world realized that really and truly they had not achieved all of its goals, and especially goals that were going to take us forward for the next 15 years. So it was determined by all of the different players, so to speak, within the UN system, our representatives, our ambassadors, and our leaders who went from or who go from time to time to the United Nations, that we needed to have sustainable goals, goals that would sustain our environment, goals that would make sure that in terms of the adverse effects of climate change, and it was observed, it is known scientifically that really mankind, if we stay on the path of development, which affects our climate, our global climate, well, then we will become extinct as the dinosaurs have became extinct so many millions of years ago, but by our own actions, and it would happen very quickly. So it was understood that we now had to think in ways that, at least for the next 15 years and going forward, that these sustainable development goals, which would hold for the next 15 years, would cause us to look within, to look not only at making gains, national gains, so that we have roads and, you know, we have things, we have material things, but what is it that we as humanity have to do, nation by nation, society by society, community by community, men, women, children, what it is we have to do as a collective of humanity to make sure that we preserve our societies, preserve our nations, preserve our earth, our water, our sky, our air. There was a lot more that had to be done. So this is where we began to focus. What it is that women, who make up approximately 50% of the world's population, what it is women wanted, in terms of their empowerment, what are the contributions of women to making sure that they too contribute to sustainable governance of their communities, of their societies, and of the world.
Yeah,
So these were some of the general issues that were discussed at that global United Nations conference on sustainable development.
I want to go into the chat room for a second. Trevor asked,
So
"Are you hopeful for the future of women empowerment?"
I am very hopeful for the future of women's empowerment.
And the next
However,
question is,
yes,
why do you believe in working with women?
I believe in working with women because I understand where women have come from in terms of, as at the beginning of the show, I talked about how women just a few hundred years ago were treated as possessions, as chattel. I believe in working with women because I know that women have unique issues that are historic and that are current. For example, women are disproportionately treated with violence by the men folk. And I say that is mainly because of the history. It is mainly because women had become accustomed to being patronized by society. You know, you would say that women are the weaker sex, the fairer sex. So women were socialized to be just to be pretty, but yet women had to be very, very resilient, not only because they were responsible for making sure that we know that the next generation will not only come into being but will survive. So I understand as a woman, an authentic woman, that the part and the life of women, because of our history, because of disproportionate violence and discriminations that women have faced and are facing in terms of access to justice, access to financing that is equal with men, access to jobs, access to being encouraged by their political parties and their trade unions to the leadership of such organizations. Organizations, for example, like the political parties, would make sure that women are equally encouraged through the environment and the culture of these organizations to take an equal place in parliaments, in party leadership, in, for example, in the banks, whether it is Guyana, whether it is Grenada, or throughout the Caribbean, we see that there are very, very few women who actually manage banks, who sit on boards, corporate boards of banks and other private sector, you know, what we call the heavyweight organizations. Here in Grenada, for example, where I live and work with women in politics in the Caribbean, I've worked with women in Grenada, I've worked with women in Trinidad, I've worked with women in St. Kitts, Antigua, Barbados. And what we've found is sometimes the fortunes of women are quite good, let's say in Guyana, in Trinidad, and now sometimes here in Grenada. Right now, women are doing very well. They've made the mark of having at least 33% of women in parliament in the what we call the lower house here in Grenada. But in St. Kitts, for example, they had one woman who we, through the Caribbean Institute of Women, had worked. One woman, we worked with her. We went into her constituency. That is women who had been involved in politics, who had experience, political experience with campaigning, being in parliament, women like Elizabeth Thompson, women like Penelope Beckles, Penny as she's called, women like um, Hazel, our what we who we call our mother Hazel, you know, women like um, Joanne Messiah, and you know, we worked with also, they went on to work with women in Dominica, where very, very few women got themselves elected. One woman elected in St. Kitts, one woman elected in St. Kitts. And prior to these current elections, there were only two women in the parliament in Grenada. So we were seeing a lot of inconsistency in terms of how many women managed to get themselves elected in parliament. It was
Anande,
not,
when you think of the diaspora, what comes
yes.
to mind?
When I think of the diaspora, I am sometimes happy and I'm sometimes sad.
Hmm.
And let me say why I'm sad. Because I know I'm diaspora. That is, I do not physically live and work in Guyana. But because I've come from Guyana, I reach back to assist in whatever practical way I can. And I have, for example, gone back. I've shared one example in 2006 when I went back because I believe that as a woman who had worked with women in civil society, I needed to go and tell women that they could see a woman like themselves. They could look up on the TV, they could look up on a platform, they could look at, you know, at the newspaper and see that a woman was advocating for their rights and literally representing, waving the flag for women to know that they too can do it. So that is what I think of when I think about diaspora.
In
I think as well that here in Grenada, where I live and work, that I'm currently the president of the Grenada Guyana Friendship Association. And again, I do that because it keeps me connected to Guyana. It keeps me connected with persons like myself who live and work, and like me, may have married Grenadians or for whatever reason have made Grenada their home at this time.
In the in the
So yes,
in the chat room, K1D asked, "Would you run for president?"
it is not on my immediate agenda. For example, I would say, um, who knows?
Who knows?
I say who knows
Good answer. And
because
and Charles
as
said,
yes,
do you ever regret being an attorney?
sometimes in my very, very early days, as I said before, I did have some regrets
Uh-huh.
because
And
I discovered that law is hard work. And it is said for the men that law is a very, very jealous mistress. And I would say for me, it's a very jealous master. And as a woman um, who is a professional, who is a wife, a mother, and who does social advocacy, and I've done a lot of organizational work here, there in Guyana when I'm there, and here in Grenada, I've chaired the National Coalition on the Rights of the Child. As I said before, I work with the Grenada Guyana Friendship Association. I've served as chair of the adoption board. I've sat on many boards. I still sit on many boards. So, I'm very, very involved.
how do
And
you
I must say, I do not regret being a lawyer at all at this stage of my life because
how do you
it is
balance
because of that I have had these opportunities.
how do you balance all of that with family life and leisure? How do you balance that?
Sometimes it is difficult.
Uh-huh.
And I would say that perhaps the hardest job I have ever had, and I would say to some extent I still have, is to be a mother.
And how has that changed you as a woman? Motherhood.
I would say it changed me as a woman because I became more empathetic. It changed me as a woman because even now, it reminds me of my humanity. It reminds me that there is no perfection in life
Hmm.
because you may impart to your child or your children what you think is right, what you know. But society, as I knew it as a teenager, is so vastly, vastly different now. So it's a learning process. As I like to say, children are not born with manuals. You have to take it as you go along. And children grow, children learn, they evolve. You grow and evolve yourself as a woman and as a parent. So, it remains somewhat of perhaps my most challenging task.
In the chat room, Karen G asked, if you were speaking to a teen, what guidelines would you give them if they seem to be headed for leadership roles? Are you willing to guide and mentor young women?
Yes, I am willing to guide and mentor young women, and I do that all of the time. I think that if I am mentoring a preteen, I would prepare them, as I did my own son, for the realities of life. I think especially with this generation, when there are so many other stimuli that they're exposed to, for example, the multimedia, that even we as adults sometimes do not understand. I would tell that preteen that first and foremost, they must love themselves.